Hello and welcome everyone to another video. It is really hot today. It's like saying 26 degrees Celsius, which is a lot for all the people who are only familiar with Fahrenheit. 26 degrees Celsius is a lot, especially for Germans who are really not used to that much sun. This is not a subtropical area usually. Apparently it is becoming one, but well, I can't help it. Anyway, it is really hot and I'm not doing a coding tutorial today. I'm also not testing plugins today because I'm really tired of this heat. But we're doing something fun anyway, which is checking out what an AI is doing and how artificial intelligence is interpreting words that I'm throwing at it as images. And as you can already see, I have put here the input VST plugin, and now we want to generate images that resemble VST plugins and then discuss that. This is going to be really interesting because, you know, from a plugin developer and designer perspective, I just want to know what does a computer think a VST plugin looks like. Because a computer who is, you know, fed by a lot of images and text, a huge data set, it probably has a certain idea about VST plugins, and now we can check out what that idea is and maybe we can try to tweak it to our likings, maybe get inspired by it or find something out that we didn't know ourselves yet. You know, just like some chess players who were beaten by an AI and then realized there are more strategies to chess than what they thought. Okay, so here we have what Dall-E Mini is spitting out when you just type in VST plugin. And the first thing that we can see here, that and I think everyone would agree, is that all of these things have a lot of keyboard components in them. Actually this one does not, but usually when you type in anything with VST, then there are a lot of keyboard components. So that shows that this AI thinks that most VST plugins are actually synthesizers and not effects, because most effects do not need or even have a keyboard component. But this is also interesting for another reason, because I personally always feel like keyboard components are the least used features even in synth plugins. You know, maybe they were important in the past when DAWs weren't so easy to use. You didn't want to switch between the piano roll and the plugin windows all the time, so in order to test your sound design you might have just clicked on the keyboard a bit. But nowadays you would just type in a MIDI melody and press play whenever you want, so you have your hands free to tweak the knobs and stuff. So I don't think anyone is still extensively using these keyboard components yet. VST developers still add them to their synthesizer plugins to this day, even the really modern looking ones. And I think this AI shows us why that is the case. It is not because it is a functionality people actually need, but it's just we expect to see that, and when it looks like that and when it has this component in it, then we immediately know it is a synthesizer, and it gives us the feeling that this is a synthesizer. And it feels so familiar that it makes us feel good. And that is a perspective that I didn't have on this type of thing before. Up until now, I always told everyone, let's just ditch keyboard components. They are not useful, and let's just use the screen space for something more useful. But now I think to myself, let's still ditch keyboard components, but if we don't do it, then at least I know why and I accept it. Here we see a knob where there are some lights lighting up next to the knob, maybe to showcase that there are certain spots in the range of the parameter that have a certain meaning. Maybe you go over this point and the parameter drives harder than before. This could be inspired by amp plugins, because this thing on top here looks like maybe a little bit like an amp. There are some knobs below, and they might be those amp typical knobs like drive, low and high. It's always cool when you see additional components in these types of images. For example, on the right here we can see something that might be showing a filter curve or something like that. At least it shows something, it visualizes some aspect that can probably be modulated by these parameters below. Interestingly, we can see some cables going away from the VST plugin, so the snake oil guy would now probably say that this is a very questionable VST design. Here we see another display component, and it looks like there are some waveforms going down from it, and there are a lot of waveforms. It reminds me a little bit of an EEG. So what do we have here? This looks like a huge XY pad where you can shift this planet thingy around, and there are some controls next to it. Maybe just some lights that show certain things and some buttons, and this looks like some knobs. So yeah, there are definitely some main functionality in here, in this part of the UI, and a green display that looks like some sort of 80s futurism. A lot of these things look like they are inspired by synthesizers in the 80s, which makes me think, what kind of dataset did they give to Dall-E Mini in relation to audio software? Is there anything modern in the dataset? Okay, so then I typed in VST plugin without keyboard because I wanted to know what it would look like to have less keyboards in there. But as you can see, when you're doing that, then you're given even more keyboards, because apparently this AI does not like the word without, it just likes the word keyboard. There is some interesting knob design here where you can see this really thick looking 3D knob. Looks a bit like a guitar pick. There is some sort of symbol that implies that this button on top is in some way related to the state of this knob pointing up. Maybe that is not even a knob but a switch button, you know? Click, clack, click, clack. I really don't know what you need two keyboard components on top of each other for, but hey, that's not my problem. I did not design this plugin. This is really interesting again because we have some sort of huge display component in here, but it looks like there is something missing. This does not look like a screen. This does though. I don't know what was going on here. Maybe it's broken. Some VST plugins apparently have hands on them, so yeah, maybe that is the little thing that was missing in VST plugins up until now, that it shows actual hands. I think there is even a VST plugin out there somewhere, or maybe it was a reactor patch where some alien hands grab a button when you click it or something like that. If you know what I mean, please tell me about it in the comments or something. Okay, so here we have a very interesting module because it has some cryptic looking alien symbols, and they are sort of surrounding some centered control, and maybe that is like a knob where you can choose between different modes, and these different modes then affect all these parameters on the right module. Maybe. I also got another AI in here where you can type in text and then receive images, and I also put the word VST plugin in here, and let's see what it gives us. It gives us some image with some text or something. Then there is a VST plugin, and it has some sort of, you know, it looks a little bit like Pro-L with this huge visualizer that shows you how much you are clipping the signal, and then at the side there are some controls. That also looks a lot like Pro-L, because Pro-L has this thing where it shows you when there are certain peaks that were really too high, that it reduced the volume there temporarily, and this looks just like such a feature. This looks like some sort of guitar effect where you have different pedals that you can put in a chain. Also this whole design, you know, this font looks very metal, and I don't know what this is. Looks a bit like the front of a computer. This actually does not look like a VST plugin but like a DAW. We can see some automation here and a track and some other stuff. Okay, there are some knobs in the bottom, but then there is also something that looks a bit like a browser, but instead of showing file names, it shows something that looks a bit like a bunch of waveforms. Here on the left we can see something that might be some sort of inspector view. Yeah, that definitely looks like a DAW to me. What's going on here? We have some sort of wavy stuff going on. It looks a bit like spectrograms in some sort of browser, and there's also some sort of spectrogram view in here, and also in the middle and on top. So this is definitely a very visualizer heavy plugin with very fancy colors as well. So really interesting stuff. And as you can see, there are different parameters in here. Like in Dall-E Mini, you don't really have parameters. You can only type in a text, but here you have parameters. So let's just try different values here. Let's turn this up to 1 and then run it again and see what happens. In the meantime, I already typed in some new values for Dall-E Mini that we can look at. And the next thing that I decided to look up was Lofi VST, because we all know that Lofi has a certain vibe, and we can see that actually being resembled in the results, because we see a lot of these vibey purple colors that are always associated with creativity and chillness. So let's check out these results a little bit closer. Of course, there always have to be keyboard components, but also the color purple now. Okay, so here we see a very artistic impression of VST plugins. A lot of VST developers construct 3D versions of their plugins in order to make good marketing. And we can see when we add the word Lofi to VST, then this AI also thinks that we want to make a marketing image with a 3D version of the plugin. And we can see the plugin is actually quite easy to use. It just has one knob in the middle and one on top. So these lo-fi plugins are really not used for the sound designer who wants to tweak all day. No, you just dial in the one knob and boom, lo-fi. Here the keyboards are floating in the air because you're vibing so hard that it just doesn't have to make sense. You're sitting in your room, you're chilling, you're studying, or maybe you're not studying because you're making music on your computer. The lo-fi girl, she should be studying. We can see some books lying around here, but there is also a screen, so probably she got distracted by her DAW and decided to use her lo-fi plugins instead. And there is also this nice little painting, almost like a painting, where you have a really huge synthesizer in front of a beautiful landscape out of your window. So you can really sit down there and just take a breath and enjoy the view, and then let the inspiration float. So I decided to also put in something into the search bar that is a little bit more specific, because when you say, yeah, I want to see a VST plugin, then of course the AI just says, yeah, but what kind of VST plugin? There are so many. So instead of asking what's a VST plugin, let's just ask what is an oscillator, because that is a module inside of a VST plugin. As we can see, even that is not specific enough, because it shows us mostly oscillators, how they look like in the analog world. But we can still look at it. It's actually quite interesting, because next to the knobs we can see a little bit of a hint. There is a lot of description next to them, maybe about the signal chain, or about what the knobs are doing. Sometimes it has really cool shapes and layouts. We can see some cables floating around because you have to connect the modules with each other for it to work. This one looks really cool. It has a huge... Is this a button or is it a screen? This thing below is definitely a huge knob that sticks out of the interface in a very long way, and looks pretty cool. So let's check out what the OFA image generation AI has yielded for putting the sampling to pp parameter on maximum. Okay, so this has a lot of text, so it does not look like it's the main page of a VST plugin. Maybe it's the options page, maybe the about me section, but then there are also some other things that look like you can put values in here, but since it's mostly text fields, I think this might actually be an options menu where you can, you know, tweak some of the more advanced stuff in the plugin, you know, something for the nerds. Then we can see a huge XY pad, which looks kind of 3D. It reminds me a little bit of that one developer who always makes these analog emulation thingies for Plugin Alliance. What was the name of them? Yeah, BX. Where can I see more about this developer, I totally know which plugin I mean. I just have to find it. Okay, I don't know anymore actually, but yeah, they do have sometimes plugins that look a little bit 3D, but then still have an XY pad or something. So here we have something that looks like a DAW again. We can see some sort of playhead thingy and the arranger view and the track that is here, and you know, the track view where you can see the tracks, and something that looks like you can start and stop playback, a little bit of a mixer, and apparently there is some soloing on one channel. It looks a little bit like it was inspired by something that is a mixture between Cubase and Studio One maybe. What do we have here? Looks like a Rompla or something, because I don't know, it has a lot of lists, like when you have a very prominent preset view, and there is something that looks like a tracker actually. No, this is not a DAW, this looks more like a tracker, like something that would run down. I always find trackers so mysterious. I wish I would be able to use one, but I have not found the time to learn one yet. Okay, so this is really interesting because I was told that Dall-E Mini is the popular text-to-image generation AI, but as we can clearly see, this OFA image generation, even though it sometimes confuses plugins with DAWs and other stuff, like, what is this even? I don't know. In all, it does understand the variety, how different plugins can be, much more than Dall-E Mini. When you're just giving it the word VST plugin, it will not assume that all VST plugins are synthesizers. But on the other hand, it does not assume that any VST plugin is a synthesizer, so it's also not perfect. Let's turn the sampling top down to the lowest value, 0.7, and then run it again. Now in the meantime, let's check out this, because I tweaked the search import on Dall-E Mini from oscillator to digital oscillator. And now we can see it still thinks that we want to have analog oscillators. But I think the problem is that technically an oscillator is a digital oscillator. So even if it has like hardware, it is not working analogly but with electronics. So obviously it is a digital oscillator with hardware. I have to tweak this later and write software oscillator. But let's check out what it shows us first. Now that we added the word digital, it actually came up with the idea to add huge screens to the oscillator that show the waveform. So we have an oscillator with a built-in oscilloscope. And we have huge knobs that look really cool, and some knobs that are laid out around the huge knob and some sort of meter. So that's a very cool layout. Reminds me of one of my favorite plugins, EchoBoat, where there is also this main parameter that looks really cool and also has the craziest sound, and the other parameters are really cool too. But this one is definitely the main parameter, and we can really see that in the UI. And that's also the vibe that I'm getting from this image. Also some nice oscilloscope view on this one. This looks rather alien. I mean, it's a screen and it looks like an eye, and it's so twisty, this whole shape. I would love if people actually manufacture it, something like that. Now let's put in software oscillator. So in the meantime, I also put Wavetable oscillator on the other page, because I just wanted to know what would happen if we asked for oscillators specifically meant to dial in wavetables. And we can see that now we're getting into some sort of modular synthesis territory. Because if we were in a VST territory, then a wavetable oscillator would look like something like Vital, Serum, Phaseplant, where you can actually see the wavetable on the screen, but there are cables in here and it's mostly knobs, so it does look like something for modular synthesis. And there are also a lot of things where you can plug in cables. So basically to use this as a modulation signal, or maybe to send modulation signals here in order to modulate the frequency or whatever you want to do with your modular synthesis setup. So now that we turned down the sampling top P, we can check out some more stuff that is supposed to resemble VST plugins, and we can again see something that looks like a DAW in some other very old school Windows 95 looking software that does not even look like a DAW but more like a scientific audio editor. I don't know what this is. Album art. Okay, this could be somehow like a distant dream of a VST plugin, but I really don't know. Okay, so apparently this AI gets really confused when you turn down the sampling top P too much. So let's just put it on 0.9. That was kind of cool, and instead experiment with the sampling temperature. Turn it down as much as possible and let's go. So now we are back at Dall-E Mini, and now we have the software oscillator, and it already looks so different. What is going on here? First of all, we don't even see controls anymore, we only see waveforms. But it's not all just waveforms. Like this is clearly a waveform, this is a waveform. What is this? Is it also a waveform? It has a grid, so apparently you can draw something on it or something, or have, you know, other features that are linked to grids. This looks like a waveform, but it has some sort of spectrogram view below it. Like you can maybe see the wavetable in two different ways. This is supposed to be a wavetable. And there is some really interesting shapes going on here. Something that you would see in a spectrogram view if you had a flanger on a very noisy sound. Then you would see these types of bow shapes everywhere. But I did not ask for that, so I'm kind of confused now. Let's actually ask this thing for a spectrogram view. In the meantime, let's check out what it yielded for Wavetable Oscillator software. So now we have a Wavetable Oscillator in the form of software, and now we are getting into very interesting territory. We can see a wavetable or waveform and some knobs in the bottom. On the right there is some sort of menu, and it doesn't look like it has a lot to do with waveform, and some master controls on top. Here we have very consistent design, looks very modern in these blue turquoise kind of shapes, and the waveform looks like it's evolving from a complex FM pattern. But there are not a lot of controls going on. What's going on here? We can see something that might be some sort of spectrogram view or so. Now we have some sort of waveform stuff in the bottom and a bunch of knobs. This looks more like a spectrogram, but with a very weird signal going on. Okay, we have something that looks a bit like an LFO. What kind of visualizer is that? Some sort of mountain shape? It looks so weird and atomic. Let's actually ask this AI what it would think about a wavetable editor as software. Now let's go back to the OFA image generation, and we can already see putting down the sampling temperature gives us some very weird results. This looks a bit like the logical editor on Cubase. The logical editor on Cubase is actually one of the coolest features that it has. In this top window, this is sort of a filter, because this is for filtering MIDI events. When you select a bunch of MIDI events, with this top section you can filter out certain MIDI events that should not be part of the selection of the logical editor. Like you can say it should take all notes, or only all notes that are not a C. And then this lower section is what it should do with those notes. And then you can do some really cool stuff like randomize them between C2 and C4, and then tuning them to the next note of a certain scale. And then you can make a really cool melody from randomized operations and stuff like that, or you can multiply all the MIDI values with each other. This is really cool. You know, I'm always talking a lot of shit about Cubase, but sometimes you just have to credit where they did something really cool, and this thing doesn't look very cool, but it is really cool. And this looks a bit like that. All in all, I think putting down the sampling temperature really doesn't make this AI feel good. Let's instead put it to 1.3. And in the meantime, we're looking at pseudo spectrograms made by Dall-E Mini. And we can see it's really doing some confused stuff, like making some sort of dinosaur shape. And this, or maybe it is a parrot? Yeah, parrot. Looks a bit like a parrot. Like a dinosaur parrot. And like faces. I don't know, this is not really like spectrograms. Maybe when we're more specific. we want to see an aliasing pattern in the spectrogram. Wavetable editor software. Okay, so this is, I mean, it looks like audio software, but what exactly? Now we'll see some wavy stuff going on. That's also why I typed in aliasing in that search menu over there, because a lot of these shapes, when this AI is drawing spectrograms, looks like sine sweeps where you are testing aliasing or something like that. Whoa, 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 what's going on here? I really want to know what it would sound like when a spectrogram looks like this. That looks so fancy. Like it does some very satisfying sound. But how are you supposed to edit wavetables when things look like that? I mean, this, for example, it looks more like a drum computer thingy. Let's actually type in drum computer and see what happens. Okay, so now we are back at OFA image generation with a very high sampling temperature. I don't know if I can withstand that for very long because it's already hot in here. But let's just see. And yeah, putting up the sampling temperature lets us really go back to the VST territory some more. Wow, that looks pretty cool. Like it has a module in here and another module in there and one in the middle. There is some missing bit in here, maybe you can plug something in. And even more modules with very low controls. Like this thing is expecting us to have a huge screen to be able to read all of the different things. Is this still a VST plugin? If yes, then a very big one. Maybe one of these really huge ROM plug kind of thingies that are also plugin hosts. What is this, kind of minion plugin or what? Let's put up the sampling PEP a little bit more and also get more specific in here and search for a wavetable oscillator software, because that has given us some cool results in the other AI. Now we're back and we're looking at spectrogram aliasing, and yeah, I don't know if this is considered aliasing. There is some frequency going on. And what's this? This looks like a discontinuity in the signal, if this is really a spectrogram. Here there is a notch in the spectrogram, so apparently someone has applied a phaser. There is some noise sweep like in a riser, but there is no aliasing as far as I can see. Okay, so now we have some drum computers, but I kind of have the impression as if these are not actually computers but just drums. But there is a computer next to it. Maybe someone is currently recording their drums, so it is the drum computer because of that. Yeah, we do see someone has installed a microphone here, I think. Let's see what the AI thinks a drum set is meant to be. It has a kick drum, it has probably this is a snare. This to the left, it also looks a bit like it is not entirely just a hi-hat, but also not a snare. So maybe something in between, and there are definitely some toms in here. And this way too far away to hit it, but it's probably some sort of cymbal. Now this looks a little bit more like a computer, but is it a drum computer? Very artsy. This looks more like a mixing desk, so apparently this AI thought to itself, like, when you want to record drums you have to go into a studio or into a smaller studio. Now we're back at the OFA image generation with Wavetable Oscillator software, and we can see a huge blue component in here, and it looks a little bit like it looks in some FM synthesizers where you can have a huge modulation matrix where you are, you know, setting the routing of the oscillators to each other with all these little numbers in the fields, and then you get a crazy FM sound from that. I usually hate these kinds of plugins, but that's just what this AI thought a wavetable oscillator would be. Now here we have actually some very interesting wave shapes, and it looks like someone has clicked here and opened the right-click context menu to get some additional controls about this waveform and some more waveforms. So apparently you can tweak multiple waveforms at the same time, and there are a lot of controls in the top, so it looks a little bit like some Windows Office thingy. Now someone has activated this drop-down menu to get some additional controls about a sound that is represented as a spectrogram view in the background, and it looks like a linear spectrogram, not a logarithmic one, because all these lines are very fine and not very, you know, they don't really show you what's going on with the music. A very convoluted software. I'm very glad that I don't have to use it. It's very funny that this AI continuously shows a software that looks like it was released a lot of years ago. Like, you can really see how these menus are inspired by some Windows 95 stuff. Like that was most of the data set apparently. And here we can see some very experimental experiments with sine sweeps again in these spectrogram views. Why does it show so many spectrogram views? But I didn't ask for that. Let's also ask this one for spectrograms. Now we're back and we have been searching for an LFO, and that's kind of funny because now it looks like we are in a DJ area with recordings and neon colors and something that looks a bit like a crossfader with way too many knobs. But why is it like that? Does the AI have a different idea of an LFO? Maybe we have to be more specific and ask for a low frequency oscillator. Now I typed in 808 kick drum because I wanted to get away from this drum computer is a drum set with the computer next to it thing, and you know, want a specific 808 kick drum, which is definitely a drum computer. But even that, the AI probably thinks that all kicks were made from real life drum sets, which is kind of funny. But I would have loved to see its take on 808s, I don't know. Okay, let's see. I have asked the OFA image generation for spectrogram views, and now that I actually asked for it, I'm not getting them. I'm just getting some abstract images, and well, this could be a spectrogram. Yeah, it's kind of clear why people like Dall-E Mini more. While OFA image generation sometimes gives us some very unique results that we can't get with Dall-E Mini. Dall-E Mini has more consistency in getting us results that actually do something reasonable at all. So I tried to typing in low frequency oscillator because I just wanted to know what its take on an actual LFO is. But now we are back on oscillators in general, so I don't think that's getting us anywhere. Meanwhile, I have typed in 808 kick, not kick drum, but kick synth. And now we are back to synthesizers apparently, and the AI does an even better job creating actual three-dimensional synthesizers as it did before. It still does not look like it's really inspired by a drum computer. None of these synthesizers look like they are made for synthesizing drums, but they are definitely synthesizers. This one looks like it has a very nice wooden panel. I think I'm finally reaching the limits of this AI because I just typed in Serum VST expecting it to, you know, use only the part of the data set where some people have put in a lot of Serum screenshots, but it looks like exactly the same as all of the other VST impressions that it gave me. Like none of these even resembles the UI of Serum closely, and you get these bright blue colors a lot of times that were popular a while ago. I also typed in Phaseplant VST or Phaseplant, but yeah, that doesn't really change anything about this. Here we have a very interesting looking component. Looks a bit like you can draw something in here, which is a bit Phaseplanty. And there is some modulation stuff going on in the bottom, but not a Phaseplanty one. Very weird looking. What is this? A huge speaker or maybe a knob? I don't know. It also does not seem to know what autotune is. Autotune is definitely not a synthesizer, but I thought to myself, well, it does have something on its UI that is for selecting keys. Well, it does have a keyboard on it, but it's one of the rare effects where there is a keyboard. And it's actually one of these effects that still has this color scheme that was popular a while ago with these bright blue colors everywhere. I don't see that a lot anymore, but Autotune still does it. So yeah, that's probably one of the inspirations of that dataset as well. Even though plugins like that don't often seem to pop up in that AI generation stuff. And then I tried to find guitar amp VST effects, which yielded guitar amps most of the time, but this down here looks a bit like a VST. No, it's actually three-dimensional. It does not have to mean anything. Guitar amp plugins often look a bit 3D as well, so could look like this. But that's kind of funny because even when the whole image is already an amp, it still tries to fit a keyboard component in there somehow. Okay, so I think that's enough for now. How can I conclude this? I mean, it's kinda interesting to see what an AI would think a plugin is doing. I definitely don't think that plugin designers now have to fear for their jobs? I mean, obviously it's just a matter of time until these kinds of AIs are getting stronger and stronger, and then at some point they will have some sort of argument that you can use an AI for design purposes, but someone still has to stick the ideas together and put the stuff to the side that is not so cool and select the stuff that is cool. That's continue to be the job of a designer, and I think it's already like that. I think it's interesting not from a job perspective, but actually from a human brain perspective, because a neural network is just like a human brain that has looked at a lot of stuff and saw a lot of stuff and then made a decision that when it was asked to generalize that stuff, that it would highlight certain features like these keyboard components. That's just like when you are asked to explain something in words that would also be understood by a child. So you wouldn't always use the most accurate words, but just the ones that are understood most. And if you think that most people would understand, well, you can play on your keyboard and then there are sounds, then you would definitely talk about these keyboards all the time, even though they don't always play a role in plugins. And maybe this AI also works a little bit like such a perspective. And it just shows that you can have different perspectives on VST plugins, and that these perspectives will yield different results in the images that we create in our own heads, or in the virtual heads of artificial intelligence, or in other people's heads when we are talking about the VST plugins to them. Maybe. And sorry if I'm generalizing AI here a little bit. I know a lot of people are getting mad when you're saying AI is like a human brain. Of course it is not. It is still just a construct with machine learning, with weights and biases that are just flipped around in some fancy ways, but we can clearly see that there is some natural energy in these kind of constructs. So whether it's human or just a completely new type of being, that is just a different discussion. But we all know what I mean, right? So that is kind of a confusing conclusion now, but well, it's a video about AI, so what do you expect, right?